Hey guys, welcome back to the Fanfic Reread Project. In this episode, we will be continuing our reread of The Dark Knight Rises with a special episode covering the cut chapters from the fourth POV character. However, before we get into that, I would like to make a little bit of an announcement. I don't really know, but a little message. So I guess technically this is editing, Frankie. I'm not sure. I'm not technically editing the episode right now, but I am recording this after the fact because I made the decision not to read Barsad's first like 4 or 5 chapters. Barsad is the cut POV character. I think I edited out a few mentions of me saying his name in the other episodes, but anyway, so I had made the decision to sort of summarize his first few chapters because I was like, that's going to take way too much time, which understandably, the current version of episode 7 of this reread is like a little bit over an hour long, so I get it. However, you don't understand Barsad's full arc without those first few chapters because they set up important things that foreshadow what happens to him later in the chapters that I did read. As well, I also didn't read Barsad's last chapter because his last chapter is pretty lengthy. So I'm coming back to read through that stuff, and then at some point you're gonna jump back into the past from June 2019, and we'll read those middle chapters, and then I'll come back at the end to read that last chapter and give my final thoughts. So let's jump right into Barsad's first chapter. The police commissioner had come barreling down the alleyway just as he dismounted the stairs of the fire escape, forcing him in another direction. The tunnels he traveled were deserted and dark until he finally reached the construction. The change in pace was actually nice while it lasted. The near-constant drilling was wearing on him. So right away, this uses the first paragraph to establish exactly where and when this is happening. This is important because this was part of a sequence of chapters, and I'm pretty sure I talked about this in the place where this chapter originally was. If you guys remember, I think it was in episode 2. There was a sequence where there was a shootout at the bar where Selena was trading Bruce's fingerprints for, later on, I guess we find out, the clean slate. So you might remember that you start with the Selena chapter and it tells her stuff, then you scroll back just a little bit and then you see John's POV of the situation when she arrives. So here we scroll back just a little bit and then we see Barsad's POV. It's not as much of a move back as John's was, which wasn't that much to begin with, but still. Barsad pulled his sleeves down over his hands. He hadn't even needed a jacket when he was outside, even though it was fall. It was ridiculous, he thought, how cold it was down there. Then again, storm drains weren't exactly meant for living in. He didn't like it, but he didn't complain. It wasn't like they could leave yet. He came upon a cavernous space filled with the sound of rushing water bouncing off of concrete. There, at least, the water drowned out the drilling. The lights were much brighter there as well, but they couldn't completely chase the dismal gray from the place. The mercenaries jokingly called it Bane's lair. They said he hoarded his technology the way a dragon hoarded gold and jewels. He thought that was silly. Dragons did not hoard. So, 2 things. Number 1, dragons did not hoard. Like, he said that with such certainty. I wonder why. Number 2, Pin Barsad constantly complaining about, like, the temperature and, like, the noise down here, because this is a thing that comes up in all of his chapters, pretty much. It's not always these things specifically, but he complains a lot. And this is what I was talking about. This is why I said I needed to read these, because it's foreshadowing. It's almost like he's uncomfortable about something, but he's displacing it onto other annoying things, huh? He was headed toward the place where they'd been living, but he felt someone grab his arm. "Hey," Ross said to him. She was a broad woman, worn weary past her 30 years, with short black hair and soft black eyes set in a hardened face. "Did he send you up there?" she asked him, raising an eyebrow. The white blue lights threw the scars on her cheek into bas relief. Barsad shook his head. "Rostam asked me." She pulled the rifle from his hands. He started again, but she put a hand on his arm. "Wait." He just about made it to where Bane was, but when he looked back he saw 2 men there that he didn't recognize standing behind a third lying unconscious on the ground. Bane was crouched to the ground, tending to the fire they used to warm their bed. Ground. The slithering tattoos that covered his back glowered deep black against his fallow skin on the ground. You know what? A little comment. I think I actually may have mentioned this before, but I'm not entirely sure. The way that this story comes up with these sort of like weird synonyms for words to describe people's skin color, but it makes it hard for me to imagine what anyone's skin color actually is. I think fallow is supposed to be like a very light brown color. I think. But you might remember, like, I think John Blake's skin color was described as cream or something like that. And it's like, I mean, sure, I understand what that is, but because of certain things, like, it makes it kind of difficult to understand that John Blake isn't white. And it's just, like, so weird and sort of obtuse. Like, remember in Batman Begins when, like, Commissioner Loeb was just described as a tall black man? What happened to that? Like Bruce describing Selena as light skinned gave me a better image of what she looked like than any of these weird, like, words. Anyway, why are you here? He asked them. He could hear him clearly over the water, though he hadn't raised his voice. Oh, I kind of like that. Wow. Because it kind of goes two ways, not to stop immediately again, but there's either A, the implication that Barsad's hearing is just that good, or B, the implication that Bane's voice is amplified somehow despite it not being raised. Which, as we will see later, both of those things are actually the case, so I think that's kind of cool. One of the men kicked the man on the ground. Answer him! He rose and turned to face them. I'm asking you. That's Bane, if it's not clear. I know I stopped at a weird place, so it made it hard to follow who this is, but also the pronoun game. The man spoke again. It's the police commissioner. And you brought him down here? Barsad cringed lightly. He could just hear the anger hiding in Bane's voice. The second man answered him then. He was shaking slightly and wringing his wrists. We didn't know what to do. We just panicked. Bane finished for him. The man nodded fervently in agreement. Bane turned back to the first man. Search him. The man crouched down and removed the contents of the unconscious man's jacket. Oh, Jesus Christ. He literally said it was the police commissioner. Just say it's the commissioner. Oh, my God. His wallet, badge, gun, and some folded papers. He threw them all on the floor, save for the papers and the gun, which Bane took. The man stood as Bane began to read them. Barsad squinted. He could have sworn he'd just seen the man on the floor move. He rolled himself off the edge into the rushing water below. Gunshots rang out as other men ran to the railings with their guns. Then it went quiet. I have to say, the chapter where Selena takes Bruce down into the storm drains to fight Bane gave a better description of said storm drains than this ever did. Like, I feel like the only reason I know what this space looks like at all is because I have seen the movie multiple times. It is really hard to figure out, like, what's going on here, even though you get a feeling for the place, definitely. But the actual, like, setup of it, we have no idea where the running water is coming from, what these railings are overlooking, and, like, why they're there. It just feels very much like these are some pieces that I threw in there, but I didn't describe where they actually are at all. The first man turned back to Bane. He's dead. Then show me his body. That water runs to any one of the outflows. We'd never find him. Then Bane's eyes were on Roz. She didn't hesitate to go to him, but Barsad stayed behind. He watched as she handed him the GPS she pulled from her jacket, and then as Bane tucked it into the jacket of the first man, the second watched it all with wide eyes. Follow him, Bane said, tapping the man on the chest. Follow him? Barsad blinked as a single gunshot went off. The man fell backwards into the water himself. The other man scurried off in the other direction towards the service tunnels. Barsad watched as the man's body went the same way as the commissioner's had until it disappeared into a tunnel. He jumped when Roz tapped him on the shoulder. Seems like she got over there very fast, but Barsad did say he was almost there, so I guess that makes sense. Go, she said. He wants you. Barsad moved from his place and reached the destination he'd originally intended. So that seems like a fancy way of all those times in the other parts of the story where it's like, we ended up here just like we said we would. And it's like, ugh. No matter how you put it, it's still annoying. Why didn't you come forward? Bane said. His voice had softened considerably. I didn't want to interrupt. Bane nodded. He hesitated a bit before he started to explain himself. Okay. Just say Barsad's name. There are two people using he, him pronouns. How hard is it? Jesus Christ. I know where you were, Bane told him. Of course he did, Barsad thought. In the silence, he found himself looking towards the pit again. What is it? Bane asked him. Is he really dead? The police commissioner? Bane was silent for a minute and then shook his head. No. He turned back to the fire. Come, I have supper. And that is the end of that chapter. Okay, so for all of its issues, this actually does do a halfway decent job of setting up Bane and Barsad and all this other stuff. So one thing I will say is that Roz, that character, I used to have issues with the fact that I wrote her in because at the time, I think I just wanted another person from the movement that Barsad could like talk to that wasn't Bane because she wasn't originally in it. I added her because I did edit Barsad's chapters before I cut them, some of them, not all of them. But I added her in for the reason I said. But then after a while, I think it was during the fanfic reread or not the fanfic reread project, the fanfic live tweets that I used to do on my Twitter. Maybe during the first version of this that I did back in 2018, but I'm not sure. But when I read through it, I was like, oh, she comes and she takes moments from Bane, so it lessens their relationship. And there are some moments that I think that she shouldn't have been there. However, at the same time, I think that this chapter also shows why she is there and how it can be a good thing. Because that moment where Bane motions to her and she comes forward and gives him the GPS and then like shoots the guy, it makes so much more sense that he would do that with someone who is like an adult and part of the movement rather than Barsad, like the original chapter had it. In the movie, it was Barsad, but in the movie, Barsad's like a 30-something-year-old man and he's not Bane's son, you know? So it's different with his like teenage son, yes, and this is the thing that comes up, like, yes, Barsad is part of the movement, but he is still Bane's son, you know? So the situation is a little bit different, and I think that, at least in this chapter, her presence totally makes sense. There might be some later on. I think Barsad's next chapter, technically, is one where I would have maybe preferred Bane to have his original lines that Roz got, but it is what it is. Overall, this chapter is all right. The writing in all of this stuff is probably going to be very, like, which is a common thing throughout the story anyway. But I think that for the most part, it did establish some good stuff going forward. In particular, we see like that Barsad is part of this thing. We don't really get to the bit where it says that he's Bane's son yet, but I think the implication is clear. Yeah, it doesn't really have to come right out. I mean, they warmed their bed, like, why would they share a bed otherwise? And this is a child, you know? But I think, this chapter does a nice subtle job of establishing Bane's powers in just one line. That was really good. That bit where Barsad's like, is the police commissioner still alive? And Bane's just like, no. Like, that was really nice. As well as the whole thing that I mentioned with Barsad's hearing and like Bane's voice and stuff. It introduces Roz pretty well. It's very short. And I do think it could have done more, but for what it is fine. So with that, we are going to move on to Barsad's next chapter, which takes place during the stock exchange hit. His was the first in that sequence of chapters. Bane had him wait upstairs. He didn't argue. He knew he looked too young to pass as anybody here, and he didn't know how much he wanted to be downstairs anyway. He was to be downstairs as soon as he heard Bane enter and take care of the security at the front, and even over all the noise he could hear just fine. Okay. That moment where he says, and over all the noise he could hear just fine, it reminds me of a moment from a reread that is a little bit further down the line right now. So later down the line, we will be reading what is called Coven Phase 1, which is the second round of Keep Breathing drafts, and Keep Breathing is a Marvel AU that I have. You can hear about it more when I post those episodes anyway. So in the Coven Phase 1 draft of the Captain America story from Keep Breathing, there is a line where Peggy, who is telepathic, says that Dr. Erskine and Colonel Phillips were standing kind of far away, but she didn't need ears to hear. And that reminds me so much of that. And it's just like, you don't have to do that kind of shit to establish that someone has good hearing or that they're psychic. Like, it's so obvious, and it bothers me too because this story in particular, especially in the edited chapters, was doing such a good job of being subtle about the different powers and stuff. Like, Bane having powers doesn't really become obvious at all in the edited stuff, but I would say until the second time he shows up, because he only shows up twice, if you guys remember. And the first time he showed up, you could easily just interpret that as Selena being scared rather than something he did. So, like, you don't have to do this, you know? He lowered his ear to the floor, listening. Right there! Like, right there! You could have just went into that and shown that his hearing is good. He caught snatches of conversations he didn't care about. He moved so he could hear the lobby better. There was less going on there. You can't short the stock exchange because Bruce Wayne goes to a party, he heard someone say. Wayne coming back is change, and change is either good or bad. I vote bad, another said. On what basis? I flipped the coin. He didn't understand what either of them was going on about, and he didn't much care. He didn't have to comment on that. I would go as far as to say that we didn't really need to see that conversation. Like, I understand that that's from the movie. However, we saw Bruce Wayne go back to that party. At the same time, I guess the idea that Bruce Wayne is like back out of hiding is kind of like important, but for Barsad to be like, I don't care, what does that mean? It's kind of stupid. Like, he knows who Bruce Wayne is. He knows. He knows. Like, we literally saw in Selina's chapter that Bane knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman. You're telling me Barsad doesn't? What? Anyway, moving on. He moved again, listening for a signal. As soon as he heard gunshots at the door, he was on his feet. He grabbed his own weapon and moved for the stairs. There has to be a more elegant way for all of these people to get themselves together rather than we're gonna put him in the attic, and when you hear some shit going down, that means the shit's going down, kid, so come downstairs. Like, what? Couldn't even, like, text him? I mean, he doesn't have a phone, clearly, but, like, get him a phone. Text him. We here. Like, what the fuck? Anyway. Bane had told him not to wait for him, so he moved straight to the trading floor. Sparks flew as bullets were fired into the large television screens and they flickered out. The air was heavy with screams. He knew that Bane had entered the room as soon as it went quiet. That the air was heavy with screams, I'm pretty sure almost that exact same line is written in Batman Begins, but I think it uses the word saturated instead of heavy. I don't know. I mean, it makes sense that something I wrote in one Batman story rolls over to another, but it's just interesting that I would use that here when in the original context it was because of like the fear toxin and stuff. Either way. This is a stock exchange, a man said. He was one of the voices he heard from upstairs. There's no money here to steal. Bane examined the ID clip to the man's shirt. Really? He said, grabbing him by his tie. Then why are you people here? Oh, damn. He pulled him across the floor and shoved him into one of the trade terminals. Enter your password or I send these men to your home. The man had begun to shake. I don't like the way that sentence was written anyway. He turned to the screen and entered the password. As soon as he pressed enter, Bane slammed his head into the desk. Jesus Christ. He pushed the USB into the computer and Rostam sat down with a tablet and began working at the stocks. You know, Rostam is mentioned a few times here and there. Why isn't he a bigger character in all of this? One of the things that I will say about Barsad's chapters, and why I do kind of get why Roz was sort of like brought in and built up a little bit more, is that he doesn't have much in the way of a supporting cast. And I think I did talk about this already, but essentially most of his scenes were just him and Bane talking to each other. There were other people in the movement, but you never get a real feeling for those other people, so that's why Roz existed, but I feel like I could have done more than that about it. At the same time, because of how many POV characters there are and the fact that the other 3 POV characters cross paths way more, I kind of understand why I didn't want to bring in too many more characters. But, like, this ends up becoming a thing later on when Barsad gets cornered by one of the people from the movement for reasons that I won't get into. You'll see when we get to the end of this. And he's all like, you did this, and it's like, we don't understand, like, why he's mad because we have no idea who this person is, you know? Barsad found himself staring at the ground while they waited. He didn't even look up when he felt someone press into his back. What is it? He said to her. How are you? Rouse asked. Fine, he said dismissively. That is a weird question to ask during a what is essentially a bank hit, but also not a bank hit. You don't sound fine, she said back. He didn't respond, and she didn't move. He dared not lift his gaze from the ground out of fear that he might meet eyes with one of the traders. The doubt had come at him suddenly and had gnawed at him unendingly. I hate that sentence. If he so much as looked at one of these people, it would just be worse. That's a good thing, though. Not here, he thought. Not now. He could feel Bane's eyes at his back. Sirens sounded from outside the walls, but no one else seemed to notice. It felt like forever until something happened. They cut the fiber, Rostam said. The cell's still working. For now, Bane said. How much longer does the program need? 8 minutes. Bane nodded. Time to go mobile. And that is the end of that chapter. And that would have went right into John's chapter, which scrolls back a little bit, but you can see clearly what part of John's chapter that ends right before, so that's nice. I do have to say, the way that the overlapping chapters in this story work is actually pretty cool, because you can clearly see like where the action of one chapter begins and where the other one ends. I think the Selina chapter in this sequence is the only one that makes it a little bit unclear, and that's just because Selina's not directly actually here when this happens. She watches it on the news, so it's not clear exactly how long after that her chapter happens, but you can assume it's not super long. So, this chapter was okay. This one felt like filler, honestly, even though it wasn't. Something kind of important happens there with the whole Roz exchange, but I think, yeah, I kind of think that that should have been Bane. Because that would have given us some more hints at some of the stuff that Bane can do and then more about their relationship. And it would have done something nice, especially in this version where Roz exists, to set up a scene in one of Barsad's later chapters when he and Bane talk about something in lieu of the fact that Roz took over something Bane did earlier in that chapter. But either way, I don't really have a lot to say about that because there's not really all that much that happened. But so let's move on to Barsad's next chapter. It was unbearably humid out there on the fire escape, though it wasn't hot, which was half a blessing. Oh, Jesus Christ, here he comes. It felt like it would rain at any moment. The storm that was coming was supposed to be absolutely massive, but he was still annoyed. He didn't like the way the weather could never make up its mind in this place. See, one of the things that I hate about how coy I played with where and when this took place is that that joke does not land at all. Like, on one hand, that is more of the foreshadowing with Barsad's discomfort being, like, displaced on the other stuff. I get that. That still works. However, that's also a joke, and you don't get the joke unless you're from New Jersey or you've been there and stayed there for a while, but also you don't get it because I never explicitly said this is New Jersey. Anyway, he could have been inside, but the sight of Daggett's quarters made him cringe. No one had tried to stop him as he climbed out of the window, for which he was grateful. He wasn't so sure he wanted to bear witness to the events that would transpire inside anyway. One thing I will say is that Barsad has a little bit of, maybe not an antiquated, but a slightly more formal way of speaking, but in Barsad's case, it totally makes sense. Like, do you guys remember in that Bruce chapter before the end of the first, like, third of the story, where he was going outside? Oh no, that wasn't that chapter. It was his chapter before that, I think. The one right after the stock exchange hit. Yeah. And he goes outside and he's like, he grabbed the wall so he might not fall. And it just felt like, oh, bars also. Anyway, but it said that. And I was like, what the fuck? I feel like I'm reading Game of Thrones or something. In Barsad's case, that stuff makes sense, which later on he talks about. And it totally, like, you get it because of how, like, Barsad was raised and how he came up and him being related to Bane. It, like, it totally fits. But I wish I had been more consistent with the other characters' speech patterns, both in their inner monologues and in the way that they spoke, because this would have worked way better if the other characters didn't all of a sudden slip into sounding like they came out of profs. He turned when he heard a door bust open behind the window. I think that should say burst. Whatever. He saw Daggett stomp in, followed by Stryver, who looked absolutely harried. He kept himself low so that he wouldn't be seen. How the hell did Miranda Tate get the inside track on the Wayne board? Daggett said furiously. Was she meeting with him? Was she sleeping with him? What? Okay. There's nothing that we know of, sir, Stryver told him. Clearly you don't know of everything, do you? Daggett said, turning on him. Stryver tightened. Where's Bane? We told him it was urgent. Well, then where is the Maxt? Speak of the devil and he shall appear. I hope you guys can tell this apart. I know there's no dialogue tags here. Daggett whipped around at the sound of Bane's voice. What the hell is going on? He asked him angrily. He stropped through the room and disappeared through an archway into another. Stryver seemed frozen in his place. Okay, so this actually brings up something that I don't think I mentioned this in the episode that we just finished, but the one before that, where I talk about how I used to go kind of hard on the adjectives. This is a good example of that because this is another one of those moments where the character comes across very childlike because of it. I think it's in particular the fact that I used to use the word strop and stomp a lot when a character was angry and they were walking somewhere. This is something that came up in Batman Begins, as I mentioned in episode 5. There's definitely a way that you could have written that where the character doesn't sound like a 5-year-old having a tantrum, but I guess it is what it is here. I use that word strop a lot because I do think that it was used at least once in a John chapter. I think the one right after the stock exchange hit. But anyway. The plan is proceeding as expected, Bane answered matter-of-factly. Really? Do you see me running Wayne Enterprises? Your stock exchange hit didn't work, friend. And now you've got my construction crews working all hours around the city? How exactly is that supposed to help my company absorb Wayne's? He found it funny that Daggett was so sure that their mess at the stock exchange would secure his spot as chair past Miss Tate, who people actually liked. Wow. So he knows who Miranda Tate is, but he doesn't know that Bruce Wayne is Batman. That's a little bit weird, but anyway. Leave us, Bane said. You stay right there. I'm in charge. He determined that they were both talking to Stryver then, who looked terrified. Do you feel in charge? Bane said. Oh no! Shit. Whew, okay, excuse me. The change in the tone of his voice was apparent. He turned himself and faced the building across from them. He didn't want to see what would happen next. I paid you a small fortune, Daggett said weakly, and that gives you power over me? Your money and infrastructure have been important. Until now. What are you? The fear in Daggett's voice was heavy. Oh, there's a typo there. Oh, that's sad. I'm Gotham's reckoning, Bane answered darkly. You're evil. Daggett's sentence turned from words to muffled screams. Oh, Jesus. I am necessary evil, Bane hissed. You can hiss that. There's S sounds in that. For once. Wow. Barsad felt a chill run down his spine. He waited a few minutes before he pushed the window back up and climbed inside. Silver dripped from every surface, and it was freezing cold. Ooh! Oh my god, that reminds me of something, but we are not even near close to reading that yet. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself. Bane was just up the short flight of stairs that led to the living room. Daggett's body still lay at his feet in a pool of blood. Stryver had gone despite Daggett's orders. Bane watched it. At him? What? That must be a typo. Bane watched him as he mounted the stairs, but he didn't say a word. Barsad followed him when he turned to the door. So, that happened. This chapter feels less like filler. This feels like something that we would have actually needed to see. I think that that's because of the fact that Daggett straight up got killed here, and that's very important. In the edited version, as you guys might remember, because we just did this 2 episodes ago, this was covered in a John chapter where she goes over to the hospital and tells Gordon about it. We never see this happen on screen, which is fine for that version because that's how it's written. But for this version, seeing that feels essential, and I'm totally okay with it. And I think that this is better and does a better job of feeling essential than the last chapter. This one does a really good job of establishing Barsad's discomfort, and it's starting to become clear that his discomfort is not just it's not just the weather because it's cold in the sewers or all that other stuff. He's clearly uncomfortable with what's going on, and this came up in the last chapter too. He said it straight out, the doubt came at him suddenly, and if he looked at any of these people, he would feel really bad, all that stuff. But I do like the subtlety of this chapter more than that other one. I think this chapter might just be a little bit better written than the other one, and that might be what it is. But anyway, that chapter was fine. I like that. It was good. Also, this is the first hint. This is one that does impact the edited version of the story kind of heavily. This is the first hint that we would have gotten that the storm, quote unquote, coming, A, was coming, and B, was bigger than just a regular hurricane. Because if Barsad mentions it and then Selena mentions it, and you're like, maybe there's something a little bit more to this hurricane than just a regular hurricane. Not that really any hurricane is regular, but that did end up impacting it because it came up very suddenly in Selena's chapters. I think what really would have helped is if it had been mentioned in Bruce's first chapter and then throughout that instead of just kind of showing up randomly in someone else's. But anyway, that's kind of small potatoes. So this chapter is a little bit difficile because this was written specifically for the unedited version of the story. So, in the edited version of the story, in the second John chapter that we read in episode 5, you might remember that Bane, the announcement that he did in front of Blackgate Prison, where he's like, do you accept his resignation? That thing. He does that over the radio, and it's really cool, creepy, that whole thing. Part of the announcement, quote unquote, that he did came from the thing that he pulled at the football stadium in the movie. The rest of the football stadium stuff didn't happen. We did hear about him kidnapping the Wayne Enterprises board and that stuff, but the thing at the football stadium is never mentioned. So presumably that did not happen. However, the bit where he tells everyone about the bomb did happen in the radio announcement. So this chapter's hard because it contains events that didn't happen. Everything else kind of slots nicely into what happened despite the fact that it got cut out. We're just seeing events that we would have not been able to see in the other one anyway because no POV. But this one directly contradicts what happens in the edited chapter. So I feel kind of weird reading this one, but at the same time, I feel like I need to, at least to a point. Even if we don't read the bit at the football, the bit at the football stadium, which it's not that long anyway, so we probably will. I do feel weird reading this, but we need the bits of Barsad's character development here, or the chapters that I read in the other older part of this recording are not going to make as much sense. So let's get into this one. Now, this is a longer chapter, but I'm going to try my best to get through this in a nice amount of time. So anyway. The clear blue sky was heavily reflected in the tiled floors of the boardroom. They still had power, so they still had lights, which made it incredibly bright. That sentence is dumb. Technically, there was a meeting going on, but it was more a hostage situation. Barsad! Jesus, how am I going to get through this? Barsad tried to keep those thoughts as quiet as possible, however. This quote-unquote meeting was important to their plan. The room was quiet, even though it was completely full. All the board members kept their eyes on the ground or the table or out of the window. People hardly ever looked Bane in the eye. He stood at the head of the long table, waiting. Everyone looked up when the door opened. I think you could have cut that out. The bit where no one looks Bane in the eye, though, I think is a nice little detail, but outside of that, you could have merged that into that first paragraph. How good of you to join us, Chair and President, Bane said. Miranda Tate and Lucius Fox wore looks of absolute shock on their faces. Why so much absolute? Now all I need is one ordinary member. Mr. Fox, would you care to nominate? No, a white-haired man said as he stood. I'll volunteer. He moved forward with the others, pressing them out of the doors. Where are you taking us? Fox said, but none of them answered. He would see soon enough, anyway. They led them below, through the basement, full of the weapons and vehicles and all manner... The weapons and vehicles? What? Anyway. Full of the weapons and vehicles and all manner of other things. He noticed that Fox was looking around uncomfortably. He knew it was because he hadn't hidden his toys well enough. The hole Bane had blasted through the floor was in the middle of the large room. He could see right down to the sewers. The way that this story switches back and forth between the sewers and the storm drains is a little bit confusing because those are different things, and the distinction is very important for why Bane was able to hide down there for so long, but whatever, I guess. He saw Miss Tate stop abruptly. Rostam jabbed her in the back. Keep moving, he hissed in her ear. Okay, now, I could talk about this because I commented on this in the last chapter and then forgot about it. So, I have a tendency in these stories to have a character hiss things that you can't hiss. For what it's worth, if a character is quote-unquote hissing something, you should expect to hear some s sounds in it because that's what hissing is, you know? Keep moving. Like, I can't even think of how you hiss that, you know? The reason that I noticed it before and mentioned, like, oh, it has the sounds is because of another, like, way, way later reread that we won't be doing until we get to the 2016 stuff, which is Call It What You Want. That story has multiple moments of characters, quote-unquote, hissing things that don't have the letter S or an S sound in it. It's great. Anyway, moving on. Do not put your hands on me. He grabbed her by the arm, but removed it as soon as he did. He looked at her in bewilderment. She only glared at him and pulled down her sleeve. Don't touch her. He looked at him. What? 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 Anyway, go. He walked ahead of them the rest of the way. Okay, so this little moment, I'm going to ask you to actually ignore it. Let's strike it from the record. Because this is foreshadowing to something that happened with Miranda in the original version of the story. But the chapter where you would have seen what this actually amounted to is cut. Like, it straight up doesn't exist anymore. So it doesn't mean anything anymore, and I'm pretty sure I was going to write it out anyway. So this whole thing is just stupid. They moved all the way down to the sewers to where more of theirs were waiting with Dr. Pavlov. He noticed the look of shock on all three of their faces when they saw him, especially Miss Tate. Oh, that's actually kind of a nice callback to the Bruce chapter that happened after the stock exchange hit. They had already blown the hole in the wall. They moved over the rubble into the reactor. I hate that more of theirs, though. Anyway, Bane turned to Fox once they approached it. Turn it on. Fox shook his head slowly. One of the others took the old man by the arm and threw him to the ground, pointing a gun at his head. I only need one other board member. There are 8 more upstairs. Lucius, he heard her say, voice tight and quiet, you'll kill this man and yourself and barely slow them down. She stepped forward herself and pressed a shaking hand into the control panel. He stepped forward after that. Once they pulled him from the floor, the old man stepped up as well. When this says the old man, is it referring to Mr. Fredericks, who is the third person who volunteered? Because Fox is also old. That's very confusing. I should have made that more clear. I could have said the old white man, because then it would have been more clear that we're talking about Mr. Fredericks and not Fox, because Fox was established as being black back in Batman Begins. The lines of the core began to glow as the thing powered up. He could see Dr. Pavlov watching it, almost in a trance, one he snapped out of when Bane spoke to him. Do your work, Bane said to him, and then turned back to them. Take them back to the surface. People of their status deserve to experience the next era of Western civilization. He went with the others through the hole, back to the sewers. Pavlov was still working when they returned to the bunker. He could see why Wayne had taken all the trouble to bury the place under the water in layers of concrete, but he still didn't understand why he'd never flooded the thing. Why even take the security measures if he wasn't going to use them? Good question. Anyway, Bane was seated on the steps leading to the reactor's control panel. He did not look up. Okay, sometimes when Barsad drops the contractions, it just feels off. I may have talked about this. I think I did. Essentially, if I didn't explain it, I'll explain it briefly here. But when I say dropped a contraction, it's a place where I normally would write didn't, but instead it says did not, or had not instead of hadn't, you know? And I say dropping a contraction because, again, when I speak, I don't not use contractions, you know? Like, that's just the way that modern English speakers, for the most part, at least where I live, speak. But when we don't use a contraction, there's usually a reason why. Like, if someone says, oh, I cannot wait, like a thing like that, you know? But anyway, it makes it hard to read sometimes because I trip over it. There are times where it works, but even in like stuff that's supposed to be quote unquote antiquated, it's better to just put the contraction in. Okay, he didn't look up, but he beckoned Barsad to him as soon as they entered. What? Oh, Barsad took them upstairs. I completely lost track of what was going on. Jesus. Something troubles you, he said quietly. It's nothing, Barsad said, sitting down next to him. You don't have to lie. I'm not. I'm just not feeling well, that's all. And he wasn't lying. He didn't feel well, though, not the way he had meant. He had become more worried about their plan over time. He shouldn't have been. They had infiltrated every corner of the city and removed their biggest adversary. There was no way they could fail. That shouldn't have been one sentence. The way that this sentence is written, they had infiltrated every corner of the city and had removed their biggest adversary. That bit could have been one sentence, but after that, maybe there should have been a semicolon or, the dashes in the middle. I don't think that really works. But the point being that there was no way they could fail, that is a complete sentence, and I think it should have just been its own sentence. Yet something did not feel right. He lifted his head at the sound of Pavlov's voice. It's done. Bane turned to the other men. Pull the core out of the reactor. A look of pure horror crossed Pavlov's face. You can't, Pavlov said. This is the only power source capable of sustaining it. If you remove it, it will decay in a matter of months. 5, by my calculations. And then it will go off. Bane got to his feet. I am aware, Doctor. They had to practically drag Pavlov back through the hole while they removed it. He didn't know why he'd even bother to struggle. It wasn't like he could stop them. Barsad quietly followed Bane back through the tunnels. Okay, so then we get to the part with the stadium. Yeah, I'm going to skip over this part because this recording, when this gets edited down, it's probably going to lose a good few minutes anyway, but still, I don't want to overextend this part because I still need to read another chapter after this. And the other episode, again, even with the descriptions, is like an hour long, So I'm going to skip over the football bit, especially because it's not relevant to what we read anyway, and we're still in the parts that would have been covered by the edited chapters. So they went to the football stadium. Bane blew up the football stadium. He did an entire thing where he showed them Dr. Pavlov, and they talked about the bomb. Then he killed Dr. Pavlov, tricking everyone into thinking that, oh no, the only person who could disarm the bomb is dead now. Or is he? We'll talk about that when we get to the next episode. But anyway, so moving on. They made their way back underground. He figured the Triggerman was one of their own. They had men everywhere. There were plenty of quote-unquote ordinary citizens among their ranks, and he was almost certain that they wouldn't actually blow the island. It had taken them years to get to that point, and he knew that wasn't how Bane solved his problems. I like that line because it highlights something that Barsad says in one of his later chapters and how much sense that statement doesn't make. I do mention it, but oh my goodness. Anyway. Bane sent Roz with a group of men to meet the military they would send on the Gotham Bridge. They will send him, Barsad said to him. The soldier. He is already preoccupied. But he was still unsure of the bomb, this plan, everything. Bane knew. He placed a hand on his back. Do not doubt us, Barsad. Even he can't stop us now. I think I talk about what that's referencing in the next chapter, or not the next chapter, in the next episode. So I won't comment on it, but you can pin that because it does come up. He nearly fell into bed once they returned. It was only just becoming evening, but he felt exhausted. The quote-unquote lair was almost as empty as it was the day they arrived. He tried to comfort himself with thoughts of tomorrow. They would be staying down there only one more night. From then on, they'd be living in an actual house with an actual roof over their heads and maybe even his own room. Maybe even his own room. Oh my goodness. He kicked off his boots and curled up under the sheets, and Bane began to rub his back as he drifted off to sleep. Maybe tomorrow would be better. Okay, I kind of like the ending of that chapter. That's nice. So that chapter was fine too. What is really important about this chapter is the bits where we talk about like Barsad's doubts and stuff. And I like that this is the first time he talks to Bane about it. I did say that I had wished that Roz was the one who said it, but in lieu of that, this does work. But not only does it highlight Barsad's actual issue, but it also gives us more hints at some of the stuff that Bane can do. Because you'll notice that Barsad mentions anytime that he's feeling doubt that he's like, Bane could tell. And it's like, well, how can he tell? And this is something that gets more explicit in his other chapters, the ones that I read the first time around. With all that said, though, this chapter is fine. I know we did skip part of it, but for the stuff that's part of the edited stuff, I don't think you need to see that because it's reiterating information that we already know about. Again, the shit with the bomb was straight up in John's chapter and merged into the Gordon or Harvey Dent is a liar thing. So we don't need to go into it. So with that, we are now going to move back to the stuff that I read in the original recording, which again is another Barsad chapter. All right, so let's begin with, I think this is technically his 5th chapter, but basically all of the chapters that cover the beginning of the occupation happen already. So I think there were 3 chapters covering it in the actual story. So this takes place, I think, like the day after most of that stuff happens. So he was quiet in the back of the tumbler, curled up in his seat with his jacket pulled around him. He would never get used to getting up as early as they did sometimes. He was more of a night person. His father had told him that he would be better about it when he got older, but he didn't know. Then again, there were nights when Bane barely slept and woke up just fine, so maybe he was right. At that moment, all he knew was that he wanted to sleep. I find it kind of funny that Barsad is Bane's son, but even he doesn't know what Bane's real name is. That's a bit weird. Roz tapped him on the arm again. "You can sleep when we get there," she told him. He nodded and leaned forward on the driver's seat to look out of the window. The lights and the people all became a blur under his heavy lids. "I won't wake you up before noon again," his father said with a chuckle. He actually was anxious to see the house. He'd been told that they were going to live in one of those huge skyscrapers that overlooked the entire city. Just the thought of it overwhelmed him. He'd barely lived in a house before then. Bane had promised him that the place wasn't anything extravagant and that he'd ask them to remove anything that they didn't need. Oh, how fun. His eyes popped open when he felt the tumbler come to a halt. He rubbed at his eyes and then climbed out the top of the thing and into the street. That's such a convoluted sentence to say. He got out. And he was tired. God. Emerging into the cold air forced a sort of false wakefulness on him, and he suddenly became very aware of his surroundings. The sound of cars mixed with the sound of voices around him. The building that stood in front of him was silver and shining, and it seemed to reach into the sky itself. Almost like a skyscraper. He followed them into a lobby full of bright lights and thin silver chandeliers and ceilings that reached the dizzying heights. A massive staircase led to the balcony on the 2nd floor, and all the floors were made of sparkling white marble. It was huge and it was beautiful, and he had to blink a few times to clear his vision. Bane placed a hand on his back and led him to the stairs. You know, this is the thing I like about Barsad, because like I said, all of the other POV characters have lived in Gotham City for their entire lives, and even if they aren't rich, like Bruce, they have been to places like this probably at least once in their lives, as we see Selena apparently sneaks into places like this all the time to rob the shit out of people, and I wouldn't be surprised if John has walked past at least one of these. So it's interesting to see how someone who has probably never been in a skyscraper before in their lives go into like one of these places and be like, whoa. Like I said, he gives a very unique perspective because he comes from not only such a different part of the story, but such a different background from everyone else because, like, Selena is not rich. John is not rich, but John's, like, sort of, like, middle class ish, and Selena's, like, poor, but Barsad was, like, dirt poor before he came. Like, he literally came out of the sewer like a goddamn Ninja Turtle and then came to this. So for him, this is like, whoa! And we'll learn more about Barsad's background, like before they even came to Gotham City, when we get back to the actual story. So they rode the elevator all the way to the top of the building and it deposited them right into their new home. It had the same white marble floors, but there were two walls made completely of glass that overlooked the entire city, and the chandeliers were hung with crystals. Everything felt so big and overwhelming. He didn't know if he would get used to it. It's funny that Bane told them to get rid of everything that they didn't need, but apparently that didn't include the chandeliers. Like, would that require them to, like, rewire the lighting or something? Can they not just take them down and put up simpler ones from, like, IKEA? Ross took him straight to his room. He had the huge windows there as well, but his other walls were made of orange limestone. The floors were covered in thick white carpet, and his bed was at least a queen size. It was all so big and so nice, and he was suddenly hit with a wave of drowsiness that left him outside. "Now you can sleep," she said as she left him. He nodded and kicked off his shoes. He was asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow and didn't wake up until the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a pale blue that faded to yellow near the skyline. Those sky observation skills are just really showing through. The bed didn't have a headboard, and he could see right out of the windows just by turning over. He really could see the entire city from there. He could even see the ocean when he looked to the east. Large portions of the city looked pitch black among the many lights. His father had said that he would take care of that in time. He hoped it were true. My constant confusing of the directions here is so ridiculous. I understand that part of it comes from the fact that if you face a certain way, your left and your right changes, but it doesn't matter which way you face, east and west doesn't change. And that's the thing about compasses, is that if you face south, the north part of the compass still faces north. Anyway, it is just really, like, bizarre because, again, this is very much supposed to be set in New Jersey. So you cannot, if you look west in New Jersey and you see an ocean, we are in trouble. But moving on. His head popped up at the sound of a knock on the door. He beckoned them in. It was Roz again. "Come on," she said, tapping the doorframe. "Your father's made dinner." What? It took him a minute to find the dining room on his own. Quite a few of the others were there as well. I wish someone would have warned him. Did he just literally, like, roll out of bed and show up and there's, like, people and they're about to have, like, a fancy dinner? He's got, like, his pajamas on. He was wondering what the occasion was when he caught sight of the table. It was like an entire banquet was laid out in front of him. He actually let out a small gasp, which caused a laugh to ripple through the group. Ha ha ha. He bowed his head out of respect as Bane blessed the food. He'd never taken to his gods. And then they tore into the food. Oh, God. Anyway, that's an interesting little tidbit that Barsad apparently is either a different religion or just doesn't have a religion, while Bane is, another one. Actually, they talk about Bane's religion again later down the line, so that'll be something we can kind of pin and talk about later. There were salads and soups and a whole turkey and chicken and fish and calamari and boiled octopus legs, which he hadn't had since he was a child, and the blood was in pitchers made of crystal, which he thought was ridiculous, but they were so beautiful. That's just something you kind of just throw in there and no one ever talks about. Like, what do you mean there's blood in crystal pitchers? Also, that is ridiculous. He tried to make sure that he didn't gorge himself, but it was hard. Everything was so good. So we need to talk about that super long run-on sentence where he is describing all of the food. This is something, and this is a weird thing to say because it's like I'm time traveling into the future, but I discussed this more in depth in my series on Profs 2.0. But what I did here is, it doesn't really have a name, but it's basically using a run-on sentence to simulate someone breathlessly listing off different items because it's just so amazing. Here, it's food. In Profs, the same thing happened with food, but there is another moment that does it with an actual event that's happening. And I think, like I said there, it is a flawed technique because on the surface it makes sense. You delete the commas so you just kind of rush through the sentence and you really do get that feeling. But I think the issue is that when you read it out loud, which is fine because this is prose, it's not necessarily meant to be read out loud. But when you read it out loud, it just comes off like a regular run on sentence. And you, like, I personally start tripping over the words and all kind of stuff. It just, like, the pacing of it feels really kind of off. And number two, another problem that I had with it is that I'm not entirely sure if the breathless thing would have come across to an audience member because this book was filmed in front of a live studio audience. But someone reading the book, I'm not entirely sure they would catch on, like, oh, this person is listing things, you know? Instead of them being like, well, why the fuck did she suddenly forget what commas are in the middle of this? So it's, again, like, it's a flawed device, but I think it's admirable that I tried to do things like this because it shows me experimenting a little bit with form and trying to invent ways to convey ideas that are different from what you would quote unquote expect, you know? So I admire that, but I don't know if it really worked. So moving on. He lounged in the living room later, gazing at the city out of the windows. He wanted more than anything to go back to bed, but he felt like his entire body had been turned to lead. Bars. He didn't even move when he felt his father enter the room and sit on the couch behind him. You know, that's an interesting turn of phrase, because felt his father enter the room. Just, like, pin that, because if you remember back in Bruce's chapters, particularly the last chapter of the first quote-unquote half of The Dark Knight Rises, he mentions, like, shapes and warmth moving in and out of rooms. It's just an interesting kind of, like, is there a connection there sort of thing? I wondered. Certainly, there probably isn't, even though I pointed both of those things out together. But anyway. Are we going to eat like that every night, he asked. Of course not, Bane said. We were celebrating tonight. Besides, that would be greedy. He nodded. That was how he was feeling as well. Why did you choose this one, he asked, turning to him. Bane gazed out of the window. I see better from up here. You should get some sleep, he said, pecking him on the cheek. Bane left him to the darkened skyline. And that is the end of that chapter. Alright, I gotta take past me to task for not ever mentioning that, like, Bane can take off his mask. These are the kinds of things, like, I understand why I didn't explain it. I think that's supposed to catch you by surprise, sort of. But because of the fact that this is a fanfic, especially, and it's such a big thing in the movies that Bane can't take off his mask, or else he, like, dies. He doesn't die, but, he feels like immense pain. I feel like that's something that we might want to just touch on very briefly, especially because it would have helped us figure out something about another character in the story. Anyway, yeah, that chapter wasn't bad. It wasn't bad. The writing style of this is kind of but for what it is, it's really not that different from most of the other stuff that we've read. We've definitely read better stuff, but it's not terrible. I just have so many questions about Bane being like, oh yeah, we gave away everything that we didn't need, but then he has, like, crystal pitchers, and it's like, well, why do you still have those, though? Apparently you didn't give away anything. And is he gonna, like, donate them to the Goodwill now? Like, what? Who needs crystal pitchers? What are they gonna do with all of that? I have so many questions. Where'd they get all that food from? Who just has octopi? Like, anyway, it was fine. So moving on to Barsad's next chapter. He couldn't wait to go to sleep. He was tired as sin and he just wanted to get off of his feet. What? Bars? What is this? He'd drunk too much. Far too much. Never again, he thought. Never, ever again. He had a time trying to get himself up the stairs without falling over. Holy shit, what? This is something that always surprises me because you can tell in Barsad's other earlier chapters that Bane is very, like, wary about the fact that Barsad's even doing any of this. But then you get to this chapter and you see that Barsad went out, got, like, pissy drunk, came home by himself, and then Bane is just like, all right. Now, I will say, in this version of the chapter, he does not see Bane until, I think, the next day, so he doesn't talk to his dad. But in the original version, remember, Roz wasn't in this. So when we see Roz here, instead of Roz, that was Bane. So it's like, and he's just like, all right, haha, this is funny. Go to sleep. Like, what? Anyway. The place seemed to be mostly empty, and he knew it was because most of them were still out there. Most of the lights were out when he arrived. Why do you keep saying most? And he was grateful, but he had a hard time seeing because of it. Normally, he saw fine in the dark, but the alcohol did a number on his vision. What the fuck? Never again, he thought once more. Never, ever again. You know, it's funny because in most, like, pieces of media, people who aren't human or even like slightly altered humans, one of the like common attributes that they have is that they can't get drunk. I guess this is another fucking spoiler, but I mean, Barsad literally just said that he usually sees fine in the dark, and then they were talking about blood in pictures, so I'll be oblique about it, but suffice to say, not a normal human we're dealing with here. But it is interesting that in most like pieces of media, non-humans, a lot of times it just straight up can't get drunk or it takes a lot more. But here, like, how much did he go out and drink? But I'm assuming here that he just can get drunk, and that's a thing. I don't remember a lot of the lore regarding insert type of non-humans here from this universe, so I'm not entirely sure. But moving on. When he finally stumbled into his room, he kicked off his boots and tumbled into his bed. He didn't even lift his head when he heard a knock at the door. "You have to know your limits, little brother," Roz said, handing him a glass of blood. "See, again. I do know my limit," he said as he accepted it. 0. He only drank half because he wasn't sure he'd be able to keep it all down. As soon as it hit his stomach, the pain in his head eased and his stomach calmed. He tried to give the rest back to her, but she declined. "You might need the rest." "Don't let yourself sleep too long tomorrow," she said as he drifted off to sleep. "There's somewhere we need to be." A lot of repetition. I don't know what's going on there. Maybe this one wasn't edited. That's weird because the chapter after this definitely was edited. It's definitely different from the original version of it. Oh no, this had to be edited. In the original draft, Barsad didn't have his own bedroom. He still shared a room with his dad, but I changed that. And then I made it so that Roz was the one that did this for reasons. So I definitely edited this, but I'm not sure. He ended up having to be woken in the morning. He squinted hard against the sunlight streaming through the windows. He didn't want to get up, but he had no choice but to roll out of bed. Bane was already dressed. The halls were alive when they left the room. He felt like he had missed something. He didn't know what the occasion was. "Where are we going?" he finally asked when they were in the tumbler. You need to see that we show our enemies no mercy," Bane said. "That is why we succeed." "I know," he responded. "Then why do you still doubt us?" He didn't know how to answer him. "We cannot fail, Barsad. We've already succeeded." He nodded. He knew there was nothing to stop them now. I wish succeeded had been changed, because literally you could have avoided repeating that very easily. And he could have just said, "We've already won." Like, done. That was something he'd always known. If Bane showed mercy to any of their adversaries, it was because they were no longer a threat. And yet it was true. He still had doubts. What about the Batman? It was silly to think he could stop them. He would not be able to walk for ages. Surely Bane had his reasons for letting him live, right? They ended up back at the stock exchange. The place was absolutely packed. He stayed in the back of the room with Bane while the others all moved to the front. They had not been there long, but he wanted to leave. It was incredibly loud, and it was cold. Oh, that. He pulled his coat around himself and laid his head on Bane's shoulder. He wanted to go back to sleep. Oh, boy. Oh, that line! Okay, that always kills me. Because I can't help but think that he wanted to go back to sleep was a metaphor for the fact that he's becoming more aware of kind of like the dark-sided shit that's part of this revolution. Not that he didn't know about it before, because he was literally out there sniping police officers. Still, it is very notable that, like, throughout his chapters, we always have that discomfort, and there is a lot of emphasis on the fact that Barsad is always kind of, like, tired, so, because he's usually not up during the day because he's literally nocturnal, and you could definitely read that as a metaphor for him being, like, not really aware of what's going on, but him waking up during the day, he's, like, seeing the ugly side of things now, and it's like, whoa. Oh god, it reminds me of a line. I think it's from Dead Man's Chest, which is the Pirates of the Caribbean fic that I kicked out of continuity a few years ago. When I think Elizabeth wakes up and she's like, Tortuga was not a daylight town or something like that. But it reminds me of that. And how, like, what you see at night is very different when you see it in the light of day, you know? Let's move on. They dragged someone screaming from the back. "This is a mistake," he heard him say. He recognized the voice immediately. It was Stryver. "Where's Bane?" he asked frantically as they pushed him into a chair. "This ain't a mistake, Mr. Stryver." Oh, boy. The voice came from the desk at the front of the room, high up on a pile of other desks and chairs. He recognized him as one of the inmates from the asylum, a strange-looking man with tally marks carved into his skin. He wondered if a madman should be presiding over this type of thing. Hey, look who it is. Mr. I should be on the island right now, but I'm not. You are Philip Stryver, Executive Vice President of Daggett Industries. Stryver nodded nervously. The same Philip Stryver who's lived like a prince off of the blood and sweat of those less fortunate. Call Bane. I'm one of you. Bane ain't got no authority here. This is a sentencing hearing. I don't know why he sounds like a southern man, but now tell me, you want death or exile? The crowd erupted. They were all screaming death. Bane was absolutely silent. Exile! Stryver shouted desperately. Sold! To the man in the cold sweat. They dragged Stryver from the chair toward the back of the room. Barsad rose from his seat. Where are you going? Bane asked him. I want to see what will happen to him. Bane let him go, patting him on the back as he went. I should probably get to the end of this chapter, but I do want to say that I think this chapter in particular got cut because I feel like Bane's methods changed, possibly. So these kangaroo courts, which is basically the fancy way of saying like nonsense court proceedings, I don't know if they were exactly happening anymore. We never learn exactly why Zaz wanted to come back to Arkham Asylum. But yeah, as you can see, Zaz is replacing Dr. Crane in the scene because Dr. Crane never left Arkham Island, which we will get to talk about more when we get back to the unedited chapters. But moving on. They dragged Stryver out of a back door and led him down a concrete ramp to the river. It was completely frozen over. The big houses in the Palisades hovered in the gray on the other side. Follow the thick ice, one of the men said. You try to swim and you'll be dead in minutes. Has anyone made it? Stryver said through chattering teeth. They responded by pushing him out onto the ice. There were others out there as well, shivering in the freezing air. Stryver made it out about 100 feet before the ice cracked underneath his feet. I understand why that one happened, though, and he plunged into the icy water. Has anyone made it? Barsad echoed. They all shook their heads. These assholes is lucky, one of them said. There wasn't no exile before the river froze. The answer had caught him off guard. He hadn't known that before. Bane never shared the details of their punishments with him and never took him to any of the hearings before now. It seemed almost too harsh. He felt bad for thinking it, but there was no way that every wealthy person in the city was a horrible person, was there? But what about Stryver? He was an asshole. He deserved what he got, didn't he? By the time they arrived back at the house, he was wide awake. He almost wanted to be tired again, just so he didn't have to think about the things he'd just seen. He decided to go to the library to see if he couldn't find something to occupy his mind. Again, that paragraph kind of backs up what I said about that other line being a metaphor. I don't know if metaphor is the right word, but I'm going to use it for right now. That house seemed to be made of mismatched rooms because the library looked different from any of the others he'd seen. The walls were covered with shelves that were painted in black and accented in gold, with a floor in marble that looked the same. All of the furniture was upholstered in soft gold and trimmed in bronze or made out of ebony wood. It wasn't nearly as big as the other rooms either. It gave it a calming feel. He dove right into the books and nestled himself into one of the sofas. After a while, he completely lost track of time. By the time he looked up from the pages, the sky was starting to go dark again. He decided he ought to go and see about dinner and replace his book on the shelf. As he flicked off the lights, something caught his eye. On the ceiling, 8 little bats circled around the base of the light fixture that hung there, painted in gold. He thought it was a strange thing to put there, but he put it out of his mind and left the room. Bum, bum, bum. Oh my god, whose penthouse is it? We just don't know. Yeah, that's the end of that chapter. So, Barsad being a very avid reader is a common trait that comes up in his later chapters. We'll see that when we come back to the main document as well. But yeah, this chapter is interesting because while it is important and it's another important part of Barsad's character arc, it has a similar problem to Selena's character arc in that there is a point being made, but I think the point is being made the wrong way. So I think one of the issues with Selena's character arc in particular is that the idea of like the whole imagining people complexly concept is not bad in theory, but in practice, when you actually read the story, this entire thing is centered around A, extremely rich people, and then B, the villain. Now, I will say that the way that the story handles the Bane part of this isn't as bad. But the stuff with the rich people, like centering the arc of, oh, well, maybe these people aren't as bad, around the people who actively oppress people like Selena in Gotham, just seems kind of very misguided. And yes, like, and this is a similar thing that comes up in Barsad's chapter, as we see here, where there's this idea that it's like hashtag not all rich people. It's like, well, they can't all be assholes. It completely misses the point. The issue is not just that they're assholes because they're rich. It's not that having money makes you, like, act like a terrible person, though it can. The point is, how did they get that money? And I wish that was something that 2013 me had grasped, that the issue isn't just like actual people and how they act, but it is a much more, like, not abstract, but it's a different type of moral question than what I thought it was. So centering the whole idea of, well, we can't kill all of them, they're not all assholes, but he deserved it, but does that mean they all deserve it? And it's like, yes, it is important to say, like, maybe, you know, this type of violence, maybe this isn't super effective, is this the way we should be doing things? But the reason isn't because, well, they're not all assholes, is it? It's like, it doesn't matter if they're assholes, you shouldn't be murdering them, you know? And it's just a constant flaw throughout this story, that it's just, again, a symptom of me not really realizing the actual, like, issue here. Moving on to Barsad's next chapter. Okay, so we're kind of jumping forward here, but I guess this is the way it would have come across. Oh no, we're not, never mind. The wind blew over the water and sent a shiver through him as the sun inched below the horizon. It had been a bit warm that day, but as it got darker the air chilled significantly. Barsad pulled his hood up over his head as he wandered aimlessly through the ruins of the warehouses. He felt stupid for not wearing gloves, and even stupider for being out there that late in the dead of winter. If he was honest, this place wasn't so bad. A solitary street ran down the center of it, surrounded on both sides by the ruins of warehouses and old shops and houses. The sound of the waves lapping against the rusted metal was almost soothing. Of course it had its dangers as well. He had to be careful not to cut himself on any of the ragged pieces of metal strewn about. It was a lonely place, but he felt like he needed to be alone for a while, though he never felt that he was truly alone here. Oh, well, that's not creepy at all. Jesus. He couldn't really tell if things were getting better or worse. People were dying, but they had always been dying. They had reached the point where the riches were running dry and the trials were starting to run thick. His father had told him that that was when things were supposed to get better, when the revolution was really supposed to begin. He should have been looking forward to it. A few months ago, he had been looking forward to it, but now he couldn't decide. He couldn't really decide on how he felt about anything anymore. All of the things he had... all of the things he'd had unwavering faith in. Okay, so I see the problem here. It's like all of the things he had, which makes sense in my brain, but grammatically I'm not entirely sure, and it's damn hard to read. But all of the things he'd had faith in before were subject to questioning now. If he had even entertained half the things he thought on a daily basis now in the past, he would have horrified himself. He gave a start at the sound of a creak beneath his feet. He'd been so absorbed that he wandered right onto one of the broken docks. The warped board stopped abruptly a few feet in front of him and looked so damn shoddy that he was surprised he hadn't fallen in sooner. He backed away slowly until he was back on solid ground again. You better keep backing up, kid, because this is the hurricane district. The whole thing just fell in. It really was starting to get late. The sky was still glowing blue, but the shadows had fallen into the narrow alleys of the place. He wondered if maybe it would become too dark for even him to see. He had only just started to wake up a few hours ago, however, and he didn't want to go home yet. The lights of the city glowed off beyond the darkened buildings, so he decided to go that way instead. Again, it's funny how... And I will say, because I do realize that it comes off as kind of weird as me saying, it's weird that Bane lets his son get drunk, but he doesn't want him to, like, hold a gun. These are two very different things, and not letting your kid participate in, like, violent revolutions is not really the same as, like, oh, I don't want him to drink a lot. But it is kind of funny how much freedom Barsad has. But I think it's because you kind of get the feelings from the early chapters that Bane keeps sort of a short leash on him, but that's really not the case. What actually is happening is the fact that because they're literally living underground in a sewer, like Barsad literally has nowhere to go. He can't leave. So now that he is like out, Bane is just like, go ahead, go do things. Like he's never been allowed to do things. So it feels weird to see this character doing things when he's usually like not literally not able to. But moving on. He felt like he'd stepped into a different world as he climbed over the guardrail and into the place they called Old Town. The once omnipresent quiet gave way to the sounds of cars and people, and darkness gave way to yellow streetlights. It was still wildly different from Uptown, as the streets were darker and dimmer and narrower, and the shadowy buildings never raised more than 3 or 4 stories. He wandered lazily through a thin crowd of people in no particular direction, taking in the atmosphere of the place. He passed stores with stained glass and plants that twisted like tree roots, and dried squid and octopus, carts along the sidewalk selling food, and one he was almost certain was illegally selling dragon chicks, and a large cathedral that was built entirely in black stone with purple windows. He wished he found this place sooner. It reminded him of the small towns he and his father passed through when they lived in Jukai. He wondered if they might go back there one day. He'd never known his father to stay in one place that long. Number 1, Jukai is a fictional country that exists in this. I'm not entirely sure if it was a Japanese territory or something like that, but its name is in Japanese. That name is vaguely familiar to me. But anyway, it is kind of funny to see Barsad be like, I wonder if we're going to go back there. Maybe, Dad doesn't usually sit still for too long. But your dad literally toppled the entire, infrastructure of this giant city. He's not going anywhere, honey. So I paused to look it up real quick because I knew the name Jukai was really familiar. Jukai is another name for Aokigahara, which is called the quote-unquote suicide forest in English sometimes. That place in Japan where a lot of people go to kill themselves. I do not know why I used that name. Apparently Jukai itself means forest of trees. So I guess this place is very heavily forested, but that just seems like wildly inappropriate to take that name and use it for another place. Ugh. Anyway, back to the story. Jesus. The scent of honey and cinnamon reminded him that he hadn't eaten properly that day and that he hadn't fed either, so he stepped into the diner he was passing to see if he couldn't find something he wanted. He ended up with a bowl of pho. I never know how to pronounce that, but it's spelled P-H-O. It's the noodles, the Vietnamese noodles. I do not know how to say it. I don't think it's actually an O either. I'm not entirely sure what that letter is called, but that's the way I spelled it here. And a glass of rose tea. He ate quietly while he watched the moon rise into the sky, all big and full and glowing amongst the wisping clouds. Is that wine? Someone asked. He looked up to find a girl staring at him from the counter, thin and reedy with big brown eyes and wiry blonde hair that browned near her scalp. He chuckled. No, I don't drink wine, he said with a small smile. She raised an eyebrow. I don't drink at all, actually. I didn't know Bane was enforcing the drinking age. Do you mind? She asked, indicating the seat across from him. He shook his head. He doesn't, he told her as she sat down. I choose not to. She shrugged. To each their own. He pointed to his cup. What is that? So, ha ha ha, Barsad being like, I don't drink wine is a Dracula joke. Anyway, it's just herbal tea, really. They make it with honey here, though. It dampens the taste of the blood a bit. Did you just say there's blood in that? She said, raising her eyebrow again. Of course, he said, pointing out of the window. I've had it without it, but it's not as good. Is something wrong? Is that a thing people do? There was a slightly nervous tone about her voice. Drink blood? Of course, he said again. Her eyes widened. I don't understand what the problem is. It's not like it's human or anything. That really puts my mind at ease, she said sarcastically, rolling her eyes. Then she reached for his cup. Tastes like blood, she said after she took a sip. She had a sour look on her face. Of course it tastes like that to you. You're human. And you aren't? No, he said with a laugh. Obviously not. I wouldn't have this if I was. He heard the waitress chuckle from behind the counter. He turned back to his food for a moment, but when he looked back up, she was just looking at him, her face in her hands. Is there something you want to ask me? Can we talk about how this girl just sat down and started talking to someone randomly and then just drinks out of their cup? What the fuck? Good Lord. I like this conversation, but I feel like the dialogue tags are kind of getting in the way with it. Either that or my brain's just stupid today. And I like that this is kind of a non-reveal. that in this version of the story, I meant to have the whole like magic thing just be revealed like through this conversation instead of having like because as we'll see in the unedited chapters, there's an entire chapter devoted to them figuring out like, oh shit, magic's real. They all sit down and have a conversation with Barsad about it, you know. And in this one, this is more along the lines of a reveal to the audience, as well as this character that we just met. But there are plenty of people in the universe who know about it, and by the fact that you can literally just walk into a cafe and order this shit. It's not like the secret Starbucks menu, you know? It seems like it's fairly normal to some people. So that's very different from the way I was presenting it in the unedited version of the fanfic. So let's get back to this. No, she said, but then she backtracked. Are you a vampire? He nodded. You don't, like, eat people, do you? He laughed and shook his head, and they continued on like that for at least another hour. She wanted to know everything about him then, and he stopped just short of telling her who his father was, because that would have made things very awkward. The moon was high in the sky when she looked at her phone. God, I need to head out of here. Thanks, she said as she got to her feet. My name's Jen, by the way. Barsad, he told her. That's nice. That's different. Well, I'll see you, she said as she moved for the door. She even waved at him as she passed by the window. It was strange. Making a friend was the last thing he'd thought would happen here. He eventually made his way back to the house, and he'd made to go to his room, but he didn't feel a bit tired, so he decided to go to the library and read until he did. He was so engrossed in his book that he didn't even hear his father enter the room. He actually jumped at the sound of his voice. Ooh, that feels like foreshadowing. What was that? He asked. I said I made dinner, he said quietly, he being Bane. Oh, I ate already. He looked down. I'm sorry. Don't apologize for being hungry, Bane told him. He kissed him on the forehead. I'll be in my room. He turned for the door. Papa, Barsad said, glancing at the ceiling. Yes. Is he still there? He was silent a moment, but then answered, yes. He went quiet again, closing his eyes. He still sleeps. He's getting weaker. Why do you ask? I don't know. And that is the end of that chapter. That chapter was nice. The writing was, but the actual content was really fun. I liked him finally meeting someone and talking about it. I liked the way that the magic was revealed in the story. I liked that the person he was talking to was Jen. He's finally connecting with people from the main part of the story. It's very cool. And I like that he ends the chapter kind of randomly asking about Bruce. And that would have led into another Bruce chapter, which shows the fact that there's something kind of going on that's throwing Bane's powers off. Because I think it led into the equivalent of the second Bruce chapter that we read before we got to this. It shows that something is off with Bane's powers because he's like, oh, he still sleeps and he's getting weaker. But then it shows that Bruce is not only awake, but he's getting stronger. So it's like, something's going on there. But yeah, that chapter was actually pretty cool. Hey guys, I guess editing Frankie here, I'm not sure. So I am back again to read Barsad's last chapter, though I'm having second thoughts about it because this does contradict with some of the stuff that we've read before. However, I do think it's important for setting up the unedited chapters, and again, it completes Barsad's arc. I don't think this chapter was ever edited, but I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, so what you need to know before we go into this is that in the original version of the story, Selena and Jen were forced to leave Selena's apartment because Bane sent people after them. In the edited version, Selena makes a big deal about Bane saying that he didn't care that she was there or not. And it's made very clear that Daggett is the one who wanted her dead, and Bane's like, I don't give a fuck. But in the other one, that was different. I don't know why I changed that, but either way. So it's important to know that they had to leave as well. John and Gordon and Foley also had to leave. I think I mentioned that last episode, though, because of something that may have gotten left in there from John's old stuff that was never edited out. But anyway, they also had to leave. And also in that story, the Narrows, quote unquote, encompassed basically all of the southern part of Gotham. All of the bad parts of Gotham were just quote unquote the Narrows, which is very like, I've talked about why that's unrealistic, but anyway, these are things you need to know because this is the way that the story was written back then, and you're not going to understand what the fuck these characters are going on about if I don't mention that. The Hurricane District still existed though, that's important. But anyway, let's get into it. He'd had a pretty tumultuous few weeks. He was on his own now. He had spent weeks being miserable before he realized that the only thing keeping him attached was Bane and the idea of disappointing him. As dearly as he loved him, he could not be part of his revolution anymore. This paragraph is lacking some establishment. Keeping him attached to what? Why did we not mention the revolution until the last sentence? Anyway, he found Bane in the dining room that day. He beckoned for Barsad to sit, but he shook his head. Oh, now this part's actually kind of sad. Oh, boy. Anyway, what is it? His voice caught in his throat the first time he tried to say it. I can't do it anymore. Feelings! Oh, Jesus, how dare this thing give me feelings? Bane closed his eyes and nodded. You're leaving me. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. Barsad squeezed his eyes shut as Bane touched his scarred lips to his forehead. Goodbye. And he just lets him go. Okay, one thing that has been consistent throughout this is that Bane does respect Barsad's autonomy. He lets him go and do things. He lets him make his own decisions. If it were up to Bane, Barsad would not have been part of this. And I feel like Barsad actually said that at one point. But there's gotta be a line where he's like, no. And I understand that him not wanting to be part of the revolution, like, I think that Bane would be okay with that. I get it. But then he just leaves. And it's not like, I don't know. I feel like reading the story at the age that I'm at, having been through what I've been through, even though I'm not like a parent myself, I feel very differently about this now. I don't know. Oh, geez. Anyway. It was so hard for him to leave. He wanted to run back up there and tell Bane that he hadn't meant it and curl up under the covers of the bed like before, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't be miserable like he'd been before. Oh, that's sad. We'll ignore the repetition there for the sad. He wasn't sure where to go from there. He didn't want to be anywhere that the mercenaries could find him. Okay, now this is another thing that doesn't make sense to me. And this is something that I think I brought up in the next episode or in one of the episodes after that. It doesn't make sense to me that when Barsad leaves, all of a sudden people are like, yeah, we gotta go find him. We gotta go get him. Revenge. It's like, number one, he is a child. Number two, Bane let him leave. Don't you think you should respect that? Like, anyway. His first thought was the Narrows and his second the warehouses. There was no one down there that Bane cared enough to look for, so they'd never come. That was where he would be then. I will say, the one instance where this makes sense, something that happens later in this chapter makes that make sense, but it hasn't happened yet. So, anyway, he was only there a few days. He got a pretty nasty cut after he caught his arm on a broken pipe one day and had almost fallen into the sea again, wandering around the scant remains of the docks on another. What? He had taken to looking around the warehouses themselves, but stopped after he'd almost gotten attacked by, what the fuck? A mermaid? The hell? I forgot mermaids existed. For you guys that don't remember, back in the day, all of this stuff like Batman, Captain America, but also like Harry Potter and Pirates of the Caribbean used to take place in the same universe, so... Oh my god! Especially if these are, not that the mermaids from Harry Potter are anything to shake a stick at, but if these are the mermaids from Pirates of the Caribbean, holy shit, like, what the fuck? If he stayed any longer, he thought he might end up impaled on something or as something's dinner. Oh god. After his near-death experiences in the warehouses, he didn't want to be alone, but he didn't have a choice. He was spending the night in an abandoned house when he saw her. He watched Selena walk down the street and disappear into a building. He was too far away to see which exactly. It gave him an idea. He wanted to dismiss it at once. There was no way she would let him stay with her. It would be worth a try, however. He could decide what to do if she said no afterwards. He went back and forth on his idea in the morning, but by the time he'd finished his meager lunch, he'd made a decision. He wandered down the street, unable to find any indication or anything, until he came upon a house with a cat in the window. It's like a sign that says, Selena lives here. I love it. He might as well try there. He didn't have anything to lose. He hesitated at the front step, but pushed himself to knock on the door. A girl with wild blonde hair answered. Can I help you? She asked warily. He started to explain himself when Selena stopped in the hallway. Her eyes widened when she caught sight of him. What are you doing here? She asked, bewildered. He had started to explain himself again when she stopped him. No, Selena said, shaking her head. He said he wasn't with them anymore, the other girl said. I mean, he's just a kid, man. No one suspects a kid. That's how it always is, Selena told her. Trust me, I've played that card before myself. How do I know he didn't just send you to be his mole? She said, turning to him. He wouldn't send his own child, he told her. The expression on her face changed drastically. "You're his kid?" The other girl started to ask him, but she was cut off by Selena opening the door. He started in, but Selena stopped him. "If I let you stay here," she said, "and if you're not lying, you have to do something for me." "Like what?" "You have to tell Gordon everything you know about Bane's plan." He stopped. "What? You're not one of his men anymore, right? What does it matter to you?" "Dude," the other girl said to her, "that's his kid. He's not going to tell them anything." "He better, unless he wants more of those," Selena said, indicating the scar on his arm. "It's not like I care." That was a big asking price. It felt like betrayal, and surely Bane would find out. Leaving was one thing, but this brought a sense of finality to his departure. Could he do that to him? Could he betray Bane that way? But then, he thought, is it really betrayal? It was true. He wasn't one of them anymore. He had no obligations to them anymore. Ultimately, after a moment's hesitation, he nodded. That paragraph is really similar to one from the last prose version of Keep Breathing. Part 2. You'll see it when I finally get around to reading it, but wow, that was weird. "Good." She let him in then. "And if you squeal, I'll slit your throat. You can sleep on the couch." What? "I'll murder you. You can sleep on my couch." That is so weird. She said, opening the door to the living room. "I hope you like it dark. It's pitch black in here at night." "It's nice," he said as he put his bag down. She didn't say anything, just giving him a strange look. His new living space was small and old, but he didn't mind a bit. He lived much worse before. She had him at Gordon's place the next day. My brain wanted to complete that with "just like we said we'd been." God, there's a John chapter later on where John says something like that right at the beginning, and it just sticks with me. "We got us a defector," she said as she walked him into the house. It was more than just Gordon, however. The deputy commissioner was there, as well as 2 other officers, one of which he recognized as one of the officers Bane had let go from the sewers. There had to be a better way to say that. He ended up being just the thing they needed, for the most part. Once he got past the initial hesitation, he ended up telling them everything he knew. There were still holes in their information. Bane had kept a few things from him, but they had enough to move forward. The thing they seemed to be most worried about was the bomb, which was one of the things Bane didn't discuss with him. He'd all but forgotten about it until they mentioned it. After Bane had them put it on the truck, he knew nothing else of it. They seemed really interested when he mentioned his theory that one of theirs had the trigger. He was almost certain that they wouldn't let it go off. The others weren't so sure he would be that kind. He was surprised that they didn't ask him anything about the Batman. It seemed that they all assumed he'd been dead all along. It was only after he mentioned it that anyone even said anything, and even then it was only Jen. Why is Jen there? Anyway, he'd been so engrossed in his book that night that he didn't even hear Jen enter the room and sit on the couch next to him. "Hey," she said, "you said something about the Batman earlier, but you didn't finish. Tell me." He had started to say something, but he wasn't sure she would understand. "Dude, you don't have to keep his secrets anymore. You haven't been anyway." "It's not that," he said to her. "It's just complicated." "Complicated? How complicated can it be? Like, didn't Bane kill him?" "No." She looked surprised. "He only just died a week ago, but that's not the complicated part anyway." "Then what is?" He took a deep breath. "Bane has powers." "Powers?" "He could see the Batman as he died. I asked about him a week ago, and Bane said he didn't feel anything. Like..." She trailed off, the look on her face one of epiphany. Holy shit. She was quiet a moment, as if in thought. "Are you going to tell them that?" she finally asked him. "I don't know. Probably not. They wouldn't believe me." He sat on the front step of Selena's house a week later, looking up at the full moon in the glowing night sky. The sky was clear and oh, come on. The sky was clear and the air cool, but not cold. He wished the weather would have been like this before, but maybe that was too much to ask of the dead of winter. It felt strange not to feed that night, but after having to feed every day for a week while he had the flu, he probably didn't need to. Oh, him having the flu got cut out of the other chapters, I think. I don't entirely remember. I'll cut that out if it did. Int. Anyway, he didn't have access to any blood at the moment anyway. After a week's worth of planning, they were going to make some kind of action, something involving the special forces. He couldn't help them once they started talking of going uptown. He didn't dare show his face where Bane could see him, and they determined that it'd be better if only a few of them went. He was nervous for them, but hopefully everything would go as it was supposed to. And that is the end of that chapter. That chapter was pretty long. It was alright. I didn't really like it that much, but it did what it needed to do. I will say the bits where Barsad left at the beginning, that I think actually did have some emotional, punch. And the events of it, for the most part, do make sense. I think that Barsad asking to live with Selena is a little bit weird, but this is the part of the story where all the characters start to converge again. So I understand why I made that choice. He got attacked by a mermaid. I just remembered that. But anyway, so that is all of Barsad's chapters. Hopefully, me coming back and reading some of them out loud helped clear up some of the stuff. God, this episode is going to be a mile long. I am so sorry, guys. Jesus. But anyway, I did feel like I needed to read through that stuff so you guys could get the full breadth of his arc, and his later chapters really made more sense. This last chapter does lead very nicely into John's next chapter, which is where we will pick up next episode. So I will see you for that. If you like this episode, like it on the YouTubes, subscribe to the channel, and you'll be updated on when the next episode comes out, or whatever the new episode is when you are watching this. It would also be super helpful if you guys could check out the backlog. You can catch up on the rest of this series, as well as checking out other rereads I've done in the past. In particular, of course, I think it's only right to recommend that you go back and listen to Batman Begins, as well as the episode covering The Dark Knight, so that you understand the full context of where we're coming from with this story, especially if you're just coming in now. And like I said, I will see you next episode for a John chapter. There's no numbers in this anyway. Bye.